Chapter Dio. Fixation. Once again, Kleio stood at a crossroads in her life. A mental turnoff that helped decide her future. In the entrance hall of Terminal 1 at the airport Berlin-Brandenburg, the choice of her mode of transportation presented itself. Train, bus, or cab. Each held a different fate. She wondered whether she should save herself the trouble and be driven directly to her B&B, or whether the money was more important to her, and she would suffer the fate of the cheapskates. In her case, it meant moving the luggage there on her own authority. The first thing to do was to find out how to get there. Normally, she would have given in to the lazy person in her, and immediately taken a taxi. However, her work-shy attitude hardly paid off in the past, and she wanted to manage the budget wisely. The money from her father's estate. She did not want to waste it. It came like an echo of her mother. She decided that it was the right time to change her life, just like the slicked-up guy on the advertising poster for Next Personality Coaching recommended, and without consciously influencing her decision. Neither did her mother nor an overconfident guru. Her consciousness decided in favor of the train, which transported her in barely 20 minutes to Berlin's main train station. At the center, she was greeted by the hecticness of the big city, a stench of ammonia and sulfur on the track, and she welcomed the fresh air after finding the exit fully packed. She walked out to Europaplatz, to a less hectic position, and dug her smartphone out of her pocket. The location of her accommodation was quickly identified, in Kreuzberg, a good 7 kilometers from her position. While her gaze remained spellbound on the screen, she started to move. Somehow she assumed that the rest of the universe would clear the way for her, and surprisingly the universe was receptive. Many passers-by made way for her. Kleio eluded as some rebuked her with their stares. Her focus was not incessantly on the device. Sporadically she scouted the terrain in front of her, but squinted at the GPS most of the time. Since she lacked orientation, it was bound to happen, as fate would have it, that someone crossed her path who was as haphazard as she was. The only difference was that his lack of attention was not so much due to location as to his existential disorientation. He held his smartphone in one hand as he scrolled spellbound through his social media feed, a scalding hot coffee to go in the other as he rammed Kleio. Her mass turned out to be much smaller. But because Kleio hit him at a convenient moment for her, the impact threw him harder out of his reverie. In the process, the cup to go turned out to be less transport-friendly than the name suggested. It opened by itself and spilled the brew all over his jeans and previously shiny white shirt. Immediately it took on the mottled color of coffee and the skin underneath red. And the young man cried out. Only that scream brought Kleio back to their shared reality. Ah! Fuck.
Oh, sorry,
she apologized meekly. She took full blame, since it had escaped her notice, how carelessly he was walking around. For now, he didn't reply anything except for the exclamation. Instead, he made an annoyed, slightly pained face and inspected the damage to himself and his clothes. His brown jacket, which was undoubtedly the most expensive thing about him and which he wore open despite the cold, had been spared. The rest was visibly affected. Kleio, meanwhile, noticed that she might just as well have come across a less attractive misadventurer. He was tall, athletic, and dark-haired. Only the annoyed expression on his even-tempered face did not match his appearance. In fact, he only let out the anger before realizing that he liked her sufficiently that, in retrospect, he probably would have voluntarily scolded himself to get to know her.
No, everything's fine,
he lied, struggling to keep his composure, and confessed dryly.
That was on purpose. Spontaneously. I couldn't think of a better way to chat you up.
The incredulity elicited a smile from her. It was what he intended.
Leon.
He introduced himself and held out his hand to her.
Kleio.
She noted the definite yet gentle pressure of his hand.
It may sound a little ironic, but can I buy you a cup of coffee? A real one, I mean. That was just the cheap one from Railway anyway.
She was fascinated by the way he quickly replaced his frustration with boldness. If he hadn't liked her, his reaction would certainly have been different. But the same could be said in reverse.
Shouldn't I rather pay you one?
She asked mischievously. She frowned and looked at the damage. The marks on his chest, guessed at the burns underneath on a muscular torso.
Fair.
He held firm.
I suggest you pay for mine, and I'll pay for yours. After all, we both failed, so we'd best split the damages.
Which she thought was entirely appropriate, but
Wouldn't I have to pay for half the cleaning too?
he pretended to let the suggestion through his head and grinned.
I'll count those costs toward my deductible.
Kleio had never heard that last word in German before. From the context, she guessed he was waiving her share of the cleaning.
As you can see, I just got here.
Demonstratively, she pointed to the luggage.
Actually, I should check in first and get my things off before I explore the city. Shower and change my clothes.
Aren't I the one who should change?
He asked, pointing to the stains.
I know a good coffee place nearby, but I don't want to hold you up if you're up to something.
No. It's not that.
She confessed.
I'm just a little exhausted from the flight. A coffee would do me good, I think.
With that, it was a done deal for him. Instantly, he stepped closer to her and took the suitcase from her like an old-school cavalier, and she gave in to his passive-aggressive urge. From the next stop, they took the streetcar to Berlin Mitte, a ride of a few minutes for which, according to Leon, Kleio did not have to pay, which she did at her own risk. They rode deeper into the center, across the Spree River, past Berlin's renowned Charité Hospital and the museums around the station. A few stops later, and without their fare evasion being discovered, they got off the train and walked a short distance. For the first time, Kleio took in the impressions of the city unmolested. Buildings of various styles from more than 800 years of the city's history flowed into one another, so that one complex appeared to consist of several buildings. Framed by the streets and avenues of trees, Leon led them through a nondescript entrance. Behind it lay a secluded spot in the urban jungle. Two waitresses in traditional skirts served a couple of tables. One of them assigned Kleio and Leon the last free one, took their order and immediately complied.
Kleio, then. Like the car.
Came the next with it.
Another car nut?
She thought. Apparently, they were disproportionately more common in Germany than in other countries.
Yes, just spelled a little differently.
She cut the explanation short, not wanting to start on the Greek muse again.
You're not from Germany, are you?
He guessed, not quite sure.
France, actually. But I was allowed to grow up multilingual and spent a few years at a Swiss boarding school in the Alps.
You don't hear an accent at all,
he noted, and almost a little disappointed.
What a shame. So, about the French. No one misses the Swiss.
Ta mère. Fils de pute. Quelle connerie de merde.
She spoke endearingly, grinning.
That wasn't very nice, was it? Something about my mother. And shit. Still sounded lovely.
With the magic of the French language, even insults sound like poetry. German, however, has its advantages. Like in terms of precision. And the sound can be beautiful too.
You mean as long as you don't pronounce it like Hitler?
That's kind of what I meant. Yeah. Like in the YouTube video where they compare languages with each other. If you pronounce things the way the German does, every language sounds terrible.
Exactly. Like Hitler.
Leon concluded, laughing.
The greatest conspiracy of the Austrians was to make the world believe that he was a German and Mozart was an Austrian.
For people who don't pay much attention to history,
They outnumber the rest of us. It's crazy how quickly you're dealt the Nazi card abroad. Yet my father is Swedish. Nevertheless, I like it here. Berlin became my home.
He kept looking for eye contact, which made her a little nervous. Even though she didn't find it uncomfortable.
Is this your first time here?
He wanted to know. Impossibly, he could realize how unfortunate he was in choosing the question. Perhaps he lacked the empathy to see a sadness come over her.
no. I've been here before. With Papa,
She thought, cutting off the emotion.
it would be an exaggeration to say I know my way around.
Confidently, he pointed both thumbs at himself.
Then you've officially found your guide. How long do you plan to stay?
4 days, then it's on to the east. Think Prague. I don't know if I can pay you for your tour, though. I won't fault you on the quality. After all, the coffee here tastes excellent, and I would never have found this place.
I'll do it for free, of course.
He interjected, as if this were a given.
Don't you have to work? What do you do for a living?
I am a freelance journalist and take on marketing jobs from time to time. Frankly, in my unattachedness, I don't have very much to do at the moment. Few assignments.
This confession seemed awkward to him, which he wanted to distract from.
What would you even like to see?
Kleio shrugged her shoulders.
I don't know. Mainstream stuff? The Brandenburg Gate, the Holocaust Memorial, all the museums. I'm especially interested in the Pergamon Museum with the Gate of Ishtar.
He waved it off.
Poppycock. I'd be happy to take you to the tourist traps, but I have a few aces up my sleeve that fewer people get to see. Berlin's underground cultural assets, if you will. If you'd be interested.
She pondered, not having anything specific planned, except to go around the city's sights in order to drift as much as she could. In a way, she was suspicious and at the same time taken with him, with his spontaneity. It reminded her of her father in a sentimental way. She weighed these feelings against each other as objectively as the situation allowed. Leon made a nice impression. Kleio only wondered whether she should really believe that a potentially romantic acquaintance could be made in such a cliched way, like running into each other by chance. The question whether she would have preferred a Tinder date intruded, and she decided that fate was certainly more creative at work than some algorithm. Rarely did she feel that sense of security with someone right off the bat. A familiarity that went further than physical attraction.
Agreed.
She decided.
Where to first?
Well,
He replied, musing.
there's some party going on tonight.
He paused. She felt nauseous at the thought of partying again. However, her choice had fallen on Berlin precisely because of its legendary nightlife. She was eager to explore the city's clubs. They were as much a part of the city's cultural heritage as its historical sites.
Griesmüller? Berghain, maybe?
A poor attempt to distinguish herself with her knowledge of the scene. They were the only club names she could think of.
Oh, come on.
He said with a laugh, somewhat dismissively.
Who's talking about these joints? Apart from the fact that the Grease Mule closed down long ago. On weekends, far too many tourists want to go to Berghain, and the bouncer then increasingly mutates to more of a fascist. Not a soul who knows better wants to go in there anyway.
Slight frustration resonated, since he was apparently already turned away at the entrance, which he deliberately omitted.
In front of you sits one of those rare specimens who knows better.
He scanned the area as if no one was allowed to listen for whose ears this information was not intended, and he told her in a secretive manner.
The party is unofficial and, strictly speaking, illegal. Have you ever heard of the Spree Park?
She shook her head, and he had to curb his enthusiasm.
A really wicked location. I can tell you that. Disused amusement park from GDR times. Completely abandoned, except for a few guards who were supposedly bribed to keep a tight lid on it. I wanted to go there anyway with some friends. It would be an opportunity for you to see Berlin's secret nightlife.
Again, her suspicion sounded an alarm. It was one thing to plunge into the nightlife of a strange city with a stranger. It was quite another to go out with this stranger and his estimated to be male friends to a cordoned-off, deserted if not haunted area. This to attend some underground fete that she didn't even know if it was taking place. In his wisdom, her father taught her that it often paid to take risks, that it was better to regret doing a thing than to regret not doing a thing, even if Vincent Venier's advice did not amount to his daughter going with strange men on pilgrimage to deserted places. The idea appealed to her. She had vowed to herself to listen to her gut more often during this journey of self-discovery.
Sounds promising. Why not, actually?
Last night's hangover was still eating away at her. In this respect, she swore to herself to approach the matter more soberly today.
At most,
She thought.
counter the hangover with a drink.
Leon grinned triumphantly.
Fantastic. Let's exchange numbers right away.
He handed her his phone, so she could punch in the numbers, the combination of which he probably saw as some kind of trophy, and called her immediately. After all, she might have been playing him for a fool. Relief was evident in his dimples when the connection came through. Her cell phone announced it solemnly with a ringtone. The theme tune of the movie, A Clockwork Orange. She couldn't remember when she had turned up the volume that high. The synthesizers sounded almost a little too loud, and Kleio caught annoyed looks from the table neighbors, although she directly turned down the volume. Leon, on the other hand, enjoyed the pompous noise.
On top of that, a Kubrick fan. So you really are as cultured as you appear.
Guilty as charged.
She admitted jokingly.
It's true. Regardless of whether his works were controversial or overrated, to me he has created timeless art, and I proudly count myself among his fans. Even if it stands for fanaticism, which I otherwise reject in any form. Here, I'll make an exception.
I can relate. I feel the same way,
He pondered.
Space Odyssey was wicked. What do you think of the conspiracy theory that Kubrick faked the moon landing for the Americans? After all, he supposedly planted some clues in his films.
He formed the quotation marks with his fingers.
Oh, a conspiracy theorist.
She sounded less than enthusiastic.
Well, let me put it this way. I find these things rudimentarily interesting. But I have a hard time speculating about it because it's all you can do, and somehow it leads to absolutely nothing.
He looked a little disappointed, which prompted her to come out with her half-knowledge anyway.
In this specific case, and although I don't have a clue, I'm settling the truth between the official version and the conspiracy theory. I doubt that the Soviets would have conceded this victory to the Americans had they not been following it on their own channels. Perhaps many of the resulting shots were damaged by cosmic rays. And since Kubrick proved with his space epic that he could create the appropriate atmosphere, and the equipment was already lying around at the MGM studios, I don't think it's inconceivable that, for publicity purposes, a few better shots were created. Satisfied?
She laughed amusedly at his astonishment. He had not expected such a detailed explanation.
Okay. I can hardly add to that.
Then he laughed a little ashamedly.
I don't know. Somehow I find it hard to believe that we were anywhere but on our blue sphere. And be it only its satellite up there.
And here I see the problem I have with most conspiracy theories. They result either from a reluctance to believe in human potential, or that there is much more chaos at work in the universe. The ability to recognize patterns is what got us here in the first place. Unfortunately, this strength can also have negative outgrowths, especially in people who don't question themselves and their views. Like this whole Q, anan, merde.
She swore in French, more out of habit than that it sounded better to her.
I prefer to believe that we were on the moon and the elites aren't pedo-vampires than the other way around.
Then, in all seriousness, you don't believe that the Queen of England was a shape-shifting reptile?
He asked jokingly, which she rewarded with a smile.
I'm rather wondering how the guy who cooked up this garbage knows. Didn't he also claim to be some kind of Jesus?
David Icke. Oh my God. You really know your stuff, and then act so skeptical.
Because I know Looney Tunes, does that mean I believe in the existence of Bugs Bunny?
Touché.
He returned one of the few French words in his repertoire, inspecting his watch all at once.
As much as I'd love to continue talking to you about conspiracies, movies, and the universe, I'm afraid I have somewhere to be. Honestly, I'm late anyway.
You had an appointment and you still came to the tea party with me? How unserious.
To which he laughed, a little gobsmacked by her nature. He stood up, rummaged a crumpled €10 bill from his jeans, and laid it on the table.
Sorry to just leave you like this now. In return, I'll pay for both coffees. And I won't accept any backtalk.
A wily gentleman, her objection would have been guaranteed to follow.
Very well, then I'll do you the honor of inviting me. Can you even show up in that get-up? Like a spotted cow.
I like your sense of humor. It's weird,
he replied, almost infatuated.
I'll just zip up the jacket. Pray no one tries to take it off me.
Symbolically, she clasped her hands.
Then I'll get back to you later about the exact time.
I can keep myself busy that long. First I have to find my lodging.
This time there followed no witty retort, though one was certainly on the tip of his tongue. He found it difficult enough to disengage himself from her. He pointed his index fingers at her, obviously wanting to look cool. She found it rather amusing, liked the look behind the facade more than the put-on posturing.
See you later.
And he left her alone with her thoughts. She began to giggle because the encounter seemed so strange, as if her goddess of fate had watched too many romantic comedies, and now she was emulating them in the manner of bad fan fiction. Kleio fell silent when she noticed an older woman at the next table grimly staring at her again. Her blue-violet hair shone in the light. Not so much a fashion statement of an adolescent punk, as something went wrong with the tint. Her cackle was certainly not as loud as the ringtone. The lady was obviously dissatisfied with herself and was projecting her bitterness onto people who she felt lived more carefree lives than she did. Kleio briefly considered addressing her about this and point out that everyone carried emotional baggage. Aside from her respect for older people, she remembered that it would have been a waste of that momentum she was drawing from her whimsical change of heart.
I should stop wasting my energy on negative she-goats,
she thought, also in thoughts of her mother. After Mademoiselle Venier had planned the route on her smartphone, she discovered that it was connected to an unintentional sequel, 2024 Berlin Space Odyssey. She did not have the confidence to direct. A fixed part of her otherwise loose plan was to pay for her stay at the B&B right away. She remembered that the operator expressly wanted the amount in cash. Forcedly, Kleio first had to visit an ATM. After another consultation of the Oracle, as she used to call the search engines on the net, she saw the nearest was barely 200 meters away. She packed her bag and suitcase, left the cafe, and chastised the woman on her way out with a put-upon.
Have a nice day.
The latter returned only a grumble, as if good mood was hurting her. Kleio strolled leisurely down the street, passing many a store that she wanted to take a closer look at on her way back.
First I'll do what I came here to do,
she vowed to herself, tempted to succumb to the shopping frenzy, and she put the pair of cute shoes back before she weakened on their account. Her sightseeing tour had to wait a while. She passed a fence on which hundreds of locks hung, as if it wore its chastity belt as chainmail. Of course, she knew that those who had put the locks on probably had not remained chaste. For her, no love ever went far enough that she could have symbolically locked it up. She wondered if they symbolized how close affection could get, or the fact that even the most imperishable eventually began to rust. Briefly, she imagined Leon mounting one with her, until she realized how ridiculous this idea was. Like her spontaneous desire to consume, it subsided when she remembered the reality of the situation. For now, her visit to the bank was on the schedule, check-in, and an overdue nap. Her plan was not much more precisely forged.
Next bank.
Read Kleio at the entrance.
What an apt name,
she thought. That in the history of banking there could hardly have been a more succinct one. Not so much to the nominal kinship to the personality coaching poster she encountered at the airport. She headed to the ATM next to the entrance, took the card out of her wallet, and inserted it with confidence, only to be disappointed. Immediately the card was spat out again, and the screen lit up with the information. Card not accepted. After repeated attempts with the same result, Kleio felt discriminated against as a customer of the French BNP Paribas and compelled to go to the counter. On the outside, the building resembled a futuristic greenhouse. That impression was reinforced when she entered it. The air was clammy, and someone had turned the thermostat up high enough that even in winter, exotic fruits thrived. In turn, the little fruit that entered the bank would have passed its ripeness, would have turned to compote if it had to stay here longer. The interior furnishings were deliberately restrained, with the subliminal proclamation of how well the industry was doing, at least not as if the place would have to close down soon. In the early morning, the crowds turned out to be almost as small as the number of furnishings, the modesty by which they were picked, or Kleio's desire to wait in line longer. Just 3 people were waiting. Nevertheless, the processing of her request was delayed. A single counter was occupied, and the snooty gentleman behind it was not distracted in his idleness by anything, especially not by the impatience of a tourist. She handed him her bank card and passport, told him the desired amount, all nicely formal, and in impeccable High German. Yet, he spoke to her as if possession of a French passport condemned her to the other side of a language barrier. Kleio kept her comments to herself before he leisurely set the process in motion, while the bank employee executed all the bureaucratic requirements in slow motion. Kleio soon lost interest in watching him, as it only caused her blood pressure to rise. She was not in a high-risk group, but it could only be unhealthy. Service Desert Germany was a term she picked up in Switzerland and, as a Frenchwoman, found difficult to comprehend. Now, for the first time, she felt like she understood the concept. In comparison with Swiss banks, it was easily said. Soon, she was looking around for other impressions, looking at the contemporary art on the walls, each one of which she found to be utterly hideous. It was more pleasant than watching the bank clerk at work. In her opinion, abstract art could have its effect, but the creators of the local works had tried to imitate Pollock or Picasso in a really dilettantish way. The imitation of an imitation, and they had failed, almost as much as the bank employee at a timely service. Suddenly, her critical eye was distracted by a tall man in a suit. He came into the hall with an employee from the back area, where Kleio assumed there were meeting rooms. She did not hear what the two exchanged. It was easy to guess that the gentleman in the suit was annoyed, and the employee was trying to calm him down. For Kleio, this was another clue that she was not the only one who was dissatisfied with the quality of the services here, and that she would certainly not be giving any 5-star ratings. Even the regulars, obviously, had something to say about it. Neither the gentleman nor Kleio could have expected what this bank in the heart of Berlin would cost them other than time and nerves. The turning point came upon them like a natural catastrophe, causally and without them exerting any demonstrable influence on it. Suddenly, 3 figures entered the bank, all in black and carrying sports bags, with the conviction of their lowly disposition. They did not come for customary transactions.
"This is a robbery! Get your fucking hands up!"
one announced shrilly. The sudden seriousness of the situation became apparent to the last of them as they took the automatic rifles from their bags. The first to feel the change of pace in his humdrum daily routine was the guard at the entrance. He did not live up to his job title. Never would he get the chance to redeem himself from this disgrace. How he failed to see and act up to his task before one of the 3 knocked him down. And he could even decide to do nothing.
"Hit the alarm and I'll cough and blow your lights out!"
yelled the one, the bank employee in his sights.
"Oh, yes,"
confirmed the second childishly.
"Oink, oink, you little piggies. The rules are here."
"Everyone on the floor now!"
commanded the third of their nefarious trio. Those present, who were still on their feet, complied without resistance.
"Get up!"
followed contradictorily, and the hostages came back to their feet in confusion.
"Now spin once in a circle!"
And they performed a pirouette.
"Step! Other direction!"
Before the opposite rotation,
"Look how they dance, my puppets!"
bitter came his laughter, to which his cronies overzealously responded.
"Now lie down and play dead! Eyes on the floor!"
And the hostages immediately went back into the horizontal.
Who are these guys?
Wondered Kleio, frightened. How peculiar their expressions came across, especially the accent. She heard it clearly, but she could by no means place it, and would not have been able to do so if she had been threatened with a weapon, which happened in a figurative sense. Linguistically, she was versed enough to rule out any European origin, as well as Slavic or former colonies. The accent sounded wrong, as if it did not belong to any language, as if someone had invented it in a fever dream. They almost stressed vowels as if they were umlauts, while consonants came exaggeratedly sharp over their lips. Moreover, she could swear that clicking sounds kept slipping out of their mouths. Kleio was not a linguist, but she knew that they occurred exclusively in certain indigenous languages. Neither the light-skinnedness of these psychopaths nor their other speech patterns even remotely matched this geographic classification. And what was that? Were they chirping? Simply put, the way these three figures spoke made no sense to Kleio. She wondered if those present noticed this fact, or if their ability to think was dwindling before a gun barrel. So far, the evildoers paid no attention to her, and she desperately wanted to keep it that way. However, her innate curiosity was stronger than her fear. She repeatedly risked a glance, wanting to know what the three were up to.
Look at me again, flashback, and it's the last thing you'll ever see.
Spat one. She feared that she was meant, before realizing he was addressing the sluggish clerk behind the counter. The latter reacted faster than ever, and turned his focus back to the floor.
Flashbag?
Thought Kleio. She found that a few terms applied to him. Flashbag seemed as wrong to her in this context as their accent, the sort of insult uttered by an alien in comedic science fiction. Instead of listening to the threat, as Flashbag did, Kleio risked another look at the criminals. Until just now, she thought they didn't want to be looked at so that they could not be identified later. Certainly, a mask would have been more effective. It became more difficult to explain how the grimace of a robber moved. At first, she thought it was a sensory illusion, blinking repeatedly so that her vision would clear. But the impossibility of his facial expressions remained. His face vibrated and deformed like a viscous mass, as if gravity were pulling it downward before returning to the state of his ugly visage, not merely the skin of his face. Kleio watched as his eye slid downward toward his chin, and in the next moment, poof, sat back in its previous place. She thought the only rational thing after such an observation.
I must be hallucinating.
As inconspicuously as possible, she looked around for the other two. One was standing at the entrance, his most conspicuous feature being his immense schnoz. The other possessed an unusually long beard, which seemed as false to her as everything else about these oddities, with pronounced sail ears. The latter strode up to the gentleman in the suit, who, little heroically, crouched on the ground. With his back to Kleio, the bearded robber stood over him. Her escaped what exactly he was doing that filled the man with such abysmal horror. But the man realized the same thing she did, that these freaks were no ordinary bank robbers. Unlike her, he could obviously relate to this intuition.
The Knecht sent you.
He asked, his voice trembling.
Tell me one. I just want to be left alone.
The bearded man stooped to him, and Kleio understood him poorly.
He did, Lefstek, and you're leaving.
He let 3 shots at him follow, with which he signed the agreement. Surely, the man meant it differently. A clerk cried out, and whether it was out of panic, audacity, or both, someone pressed the alarm.
Wonderful!
The guard-faced one shouted joyfully.
Now we got to take all the rest.
There's no time for that, and it's not what we are here for,
spoke the one with the schnoz from the entrance.
This is red, Lesse.
The sail-eared one reinforced.
We've almost had enough already.
He strode to the counter.
You there,
He yelled to the woman behind, tossing her the gym bag.
fill this for me for what's in the register, or you'll end up like the other meat sack.
But who's?
Whined Glosser.
They're just about ready now.
We don't have time.
Reminded the big-nosed Riz at the entrance, as if he could smell trouble.
But I want to.
Defied Glosser, and the bearded Ooze, who seemed to be their leader, gave reluctantly in.
The big one.
None of the hostages remotely comprehended what the 3 were discussing, how much they had what of, and more could have gotten, before even 1 bill passed into their hall.
Oh, I saw my face as soon as I came in.
Spoke the one excitedly, whom they called Glosser. The one with unstable features, who was also otherwise the most unstable of these 3 maniacs. He headed toward Kleio. He began to sing, a wry and somehow operatic Elvis imitation, while he performed a burlesque dance, both full of fervor. In this most uncanny performance, Kleio recognized a classic Looney Tunes cartoon, an iconic song of the frog with a stick and top hat. Michigan J. Frog. The bizarre performance lacked the playfulness of the original. It sent a shiver down her spine when he addressed her directly. His obnoxious grimace widened with each syllable, His face deformed with sharpening needle teeth, and increasingly resembled that of a skin-colored reptile more than that of a human, and he grinned.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss, my wine. Baby, my heart's on fire. If you refuse me, buddy, you lose me. Then you'll be left alone, oh baby. Telephone and tell me I'm your own.
Like in a Broadway performance, he let the last notes fade out, stretched out his arms to his audience, and knelt in front of her. Kleio wanted to cry out, but was held frozen. As he bent down to her, a long tongue snaked out of his mouth and licked her cheek. She whimpered, which pleased him even more.
Give it to me, your chaos,
he said greedily. She did not understand, paralyzed by indescribable fear.
Stop playing with her, Glossa. She's ripe enough. Let's go, we don't have time.
Rhys again pointed out the shortage of time, more impatient than a white rabbit.
Yeah, I'll be ready in a minute,
Glossa replied, willing to make short work of it. Immediately, he drove his hand into Kleio's belly, but instead of making a wound, the hand disappeared into a void. Kleio felt nothing of it, merely looked in shock as his paw penetrated her flesh, as if it went somewhere else entirely, until an unspeakable pain jolted through her, a torment, so unnatural that her whole body seemed to writhe through space and time. Not her physical body, but something that lay beyond it, a pain the likes of which no human being had ever perceived in his lifetime. Glossa's claws grasped something inside her that she never knew was there. But this is what it must have been like to die, after or before. A strange, sweet smell rose from where his hand disappeared. An unfathomable scent that Kleio had never smelled before burned itself into her thoughts and robbed her of her senses, like a mixture of caramel, vanilla, cinnamon, and myrrh, and at the same time as none of it, like fire and blood, fresh sea air and earth and none of it, like everything sweet and salty, like life and death and everything in between, and none of it. Kleio had lost all control of her body, lost herself in the pain, and still couldn't cry out, even though the cry of her spirit echoed synchronously through the cosmos. In all its lives, before or after, there was nothing to counter this violent act except sheer will to survive. No, it was more. It was the will to exist. Suddenly, this will took on a life of its own and came to the surface without Kleio consciously contributing to it. It was the will which banished the greedy myths from her, as it took shape and emerged from Kleio in a blinding glow. A figure of light with her features slid out of her and pushed Glossa away before vanishing again in a flash. His grimace melted in confusion into a grotesque image of infernal rage. Whatever he had tried to take from her, he had not succeeded.
Fuck again,
He hissed, spitting, before putting the barrel of the gun to her forehead and pulling the trigger.